Yo, what up everyone? Welcome to part 4 of the Blender Basics course. And in this video, we're finally going to get into modifiers, which are pretty big. It's going to be a game changer for your journey as a 3D artist. So before we get into that though, I just want to mention that there are two types of modeling that we have to understand. And the first one is going to be organic modeling, which is things like characters, foliage, clothes. Then you have hard surface modeling, which is anything, of course, with the hard surface, sci-fi related stuff, structures, weapons. I personally recommend starting off with hard surface modeling and eventually learn both, but hard surface modeling is just going to be a lot more easier. A lot of the time when you're working on props and things, most of the time it's going to be a hard surface model. Definitely brush up your skills in that, and a lot of the modifiers that we are going to be talking about work best with hard surface modeling, but can be used for organic modeling as well. So with our default cube here, I'm going to go ahead and select it. And on this panel here, we're going to go to the blue wrench, the modifiers section, and we're going to hit add modifiers. And don't worry about anything else. We're just going to go under generate. First thing we're going to look at real quick is the array. Not too important, but I thought I'd mention it. The array is basically a modifier that allows us to create instances or duplicates of our cube, but it's all under one mesh. As you can see here, it isn't us duplicating the model and then moving it somewhere else. So if I increase the count here, we can increase how many of those cubes are created. And the reason why it's moving along the X and not the Y is because our factor here is set to 1 on the X. If I want to change it to the Y, I can hit 0 and then just do 1 on the Y. And now we've changed the direction of where these instances are copying each other over. And you can do some other things like make things diagonal. You can probably make stairs this way. So it can be quite useful. Let's jump into the next modifier, which is probably one of the most common ones that I use, especially because as a 3D environment artist, I'm working a lot on hard surface models, and that is the bevel modifier. So the bevel modifier has a few different parameters here. You have the amount, which is going to be how wide or tighten the bevel is. We'll see that in just a second. Then you got segments. How many splits are we doing for the edges? So let's go into wireframe real quick. And by the way, other than pressing Shift Z to go into wireframe and then going back, you can also change that up here as well. So in wireframe mode, I'm going to turn off the modifier for a second in the viewport. And as you can see, we have these hard line edges here. And what the bevel modifier does is it chamfers or splits them to allow us to get something a little bit more smoother. And the more we increase the segments, the more smoother this becomes. So if we go higher, everything becomes smoother. The amount, like I said, is going to be the size of the bevel, whether it's widened or tightened down. So if I go to 0.5, now our bevels are huge, pretty much making this round. And if I go lower, like 0.05, our bevels get tightened. The other thing that I want to mention here is profile. So right now our shading is kind of okay. We have our bevels tightened a little bit, but let's go ahead and loosen it up a little bit, go back to 0.1. You may notice that sometimes the shading might be a little off. Not really, but it might look a little bit weird. And that's if we go into smooth shading. So that's one thing I forgot to mention is right now we're in flat shaded mode and we want to go to smooth shading in order to fully see the bevel modifier shine. So I'm going to right click out here in the viewport. We're going to go to shade smooth, and now our model shaded smooth. You can kind of see this here. It's not really that big of a deal. It's just the angle that we're looking at. But if you go under profile here and where shape is, if I increase this, it's going to make our shading a lot more smoother. Now, keep in mind, by doing this, we are also making our bevels harsher and not rounded. So let's go into wireframe just to see that in action. Let me lower the segments here, and we'll go back down to 2. So if I bring this back to 0.5, as you can see, everything is rounded. If we bring it all the way to 1, and the more higher we go, it's going to tighten our bevels. That pretty much it's going to be the shape of the cube that we had before, the default cube here. It's just going to have those bevels still, but everything is super tightened, and that's why the shading appears kind of clean here. But you can play around with this and see what you prefer. It really depends. You can go a little higher too, and that'll kind of help. So that's pretty much it for the bevel modifier. Really good modifier, and again, one of the top ones that you'll probably use for hard surface. I'm gonna right click and go to shade flat again. So the next modifier that is pretty important is the mirror modifier. In order for me to show this, we have to split our cube in half. So what I'm gonna do real quick is I'm going to duplicate this cube. So I'm gonna hold down the shift key and press D to duplicate, and then I'm gonna hit X and just move it a little bit on the side here. Now this is gonna be for after. We're gonna use this cube for this example because we have two examples to show for the mirror. For this cube, I'm gonna hit tab, go into edit mode. I'm gonna do Control R to add a loop cut here. And what I wanna do is delete one side. So I'm gonna go into wireframe so I can select the back verts. And we have all four selected, hit X, and then we're just going to do delete vertices. Now we can kind of see where the mirror modifier kicks in, and anything we do to one side will apply to the other side. The only issue here though with this mirror is that in case, let's say we're working on a model, let's say we're working on a character and we're working on the head, nose is right here in the middle and so on. If we pull this model apart or we try to scale it, you got to keep in mind that it's not actually joined together yet or connected. In order for us to join them or connect them together, you must make sure that you click the clipping option here, and that way it will keep the center the same and it won't split apart. So that's where our second example is going to come in just a second. In this case, the mirror modifier really useful so that you can do things on one side and it'll duplicate over in real time. Go back to object mode. Let's delete this one. Now, what I'm going to do with this cube is I'm going to move it a little closer, and my 3D cursor is already at the center, which is perfect. I'm going to right click and go to set origin, and I'm going to set it to where the 3D cursor is at. And now you can see with this mirror modifier, before when the origin was right here, it's mirroring in this section because the origin is right here in the center. But let's say we're working on something specific, like let's say there's two different wheels, or maybe they're the same wheels, but we don't want to make one wheel and then copy it and move it over. We want to just have it already copied over in the position that this is at, so it's symmetrical. In that case, I'm going to make sure my origin is at the center between where I want it to be. Apply the mirror modifier here, have it on, depending on what axis you're looking at. And as you can see, we can mirror this way. And again, same thing applies. You can grab these and modify it. Whatever we do to one side is going to apply to the other. So that's pretty much the mirror modifier. And let's look at the last modifier here that's quite important. I'm going to go ahead and bring our cube back, and that is going to be the subdivision surface modifier. Now, the subdivision surface modifier can be good and bad. The bad part about subdivision surface, especially for a beginner, is they may rely on this too much to smooth out their model rather than working on the overall shape itself. When you're working on your model at the start, you don't want to focus on rounding things off and making things just perfected. You want to focus on the shape first. And once you have the shape down, then you can go ahead and see if you need to apply the modifier. So what it's doing here is it's taking our cube and turning it into a sphere. Now, if I increase this a little more, we can see the sphere. It's an optimal view right now, so we can't really see all of the polygons. But if I take optimal view off, you can now see how it's taking our cube here and it's subdividing it with extra edges and rounding it off. Now that's for the Catmull-Clark mode. If we change it to simple, it'll just subdivide it just as if we were adding loop cuts to the cube. So you can see whichever one you want to use. Most of the time, Catmull-Clark is the one that you're going to use to smooth things out a lot more. And I can show you real quick how this can be useful. If we go here and add a bevel modifier, make sure the bevel is not below but above the subdivision surface on the stack here. That does matter, and the mirror as well has to be at the top. As you can see now, if we go to shade smooth, everything is a lot more smoother, and we just have one here for the segment. But if I were to add two, you can see that it's going to tighten that bevel. It's going to make our cube look a little bit more smoother, but the bevel is going to be a lot more tight, and that's because of the subdivision surface. If I turn this off, the bevel will go normal. We can play around with some of the settings here. So if I increased this value, for example, it'll increase the bevel to spread it out a little more, and then it'll tighten it if we use a lower value. So that's pretty much it for all these different modifiers. I recommend playing around with them and seeing the different settings. Remember, right click and you can shade smooth or flat depending. Whenever you export your model out and it's completed, you want to make sure that it's in shaded smooth and that it looks good. It depends. If you're making a game that's like just with flat shading, you could do that as well, but most game models are going to be in shade smooth. So that's pretty much it for the modifiers. Those are basically the 4 main modifiers that you're going to be using often. There are some other good ones here too, like solidify and all that, but we'll get to that in possibly other videos that I'll do down the line just to make them more specific. But anyways, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. In the next part, we're going to go ahead and talk about materials and how we can make our models look a little bit nicer as we're working on them. So I'll see you in the next part.